much of this stuff hasn't been out of my files since 1985. So, and it's probably the last time it'll be out of my files. As you can see, 3 of my 7 contributors are no longer with us. But one of the advantages of being in a group like this is sharing information. I try to be factual as much as I can, but sometimes I have to make stuff up. I will tell you when I've made it up, and you can judge my credibility. What we're going to talk about in the first part is Silver City, why it was important for the railroad to go to Silver City. Then we're going to talk about the railroad itself, its birth in 1870, its death in 1880, and the 10 years that it lived. For those of you who can stomach people's slides on walking on the right-of-way, I will take you down the Silver City spur as it was in 1982. It is no longer that way. So this is your first and only chance to take that trip. But if you don't like those kinds of slides, you can leave and go to the gift shop, and I won't be upset. Okay, Silver City was part of the economic center of the Comstock in the early 1860s. It had 3 businesses: mining, milling, and selling booze. By 1865, people had discovered that the ore in Silver City was more gold than it was silver. The gold veins were very small, so mines came and went very quickly. And by the time we're going to talk about the railroad era, pretty much of the gold mining was done, and milling was the primary business. And you can see here early bacon mill and early trench mill, and everything came in by wagon. All these mills were steam powered, so cordwood appetite was very large, and the cordwood wagon business coming up from the lumber yards on the Carson River around Dayton was also a big business. Town had many, many mills. The top 4 were more up toward the Devil's Gate area. The bottom 4 were down near the south end of Silver City, and those 4 were the ones purchased by James Fair and his cohorts in the Pacific Mill and Mining Company. Here's the trench mill up here. This is the part of Gold Canyon leading down to the Carson River. Up in this area were 4 mills that the Pacific Mill and Mining Company bought to achieve vertical integration. They didn't trust Sheridan Mills to mill their ore and give them the right numbers. During the early years, this was filled with tailing mills. The Humphrey, Excelsior, and Atlanta survived through the railroad era. In fact, the Atlanta stayed in business till I think like 1882. Down along the river here were the Ophir Mills and the Franklin, and they play a major part in our story. Here is another view of Silver City before the railroad. Amazing that this picture survived, and with the help of Photoshop it's even clearer. These are the mills. These are the 4 mills that Mr. Fair purchased to achieve vertical integration, because they had not, of course, built their mills in Virginia City. He bought the Sullivan and tore it down immediately because they wanted to be able to store cordwood here. The Bacon and the Trench, of course, were the major mills. The Kelsey was a backup mill. This is the Nevada Foundry. It had the patterns for almost every mill on the Comstock. And soon after the railroad was built, the pattern shop burned. They spent a year putting it back together again, and then after that year, the whole foundry burned down. The owner decided to give up on Silver City without its fire department, and he purchased the Fulton Foundry in Virginia City.
Charlie, what direction are we looking, please?
That way. North is that way. south is this way.
Oh, look at west.
Give me a second. This mill behind the Sullivan, which we don't know the name of, was recorded for posterity. I don't know where I got these pictures, but I was surprised to find them. We actually have a map of Silver City that was done in 1874, and it looks very much like a fire insurance map. This is a redrawing of that map that was done for the electric utility because it wanted to know where all the property lines were within Silver City. This is where all the mills were down there, Devil's Gate. There were some mills here in the center of town, and then of course the mills that concern us most, the Trench and the Bacon and the Kelsey, were up here, and then down Gold Canyon. Another view of Silver City. This is the Devil's Gate area, Devil's Gate Mill and the Pioneer Mill, and you can see everything came on down by wagon. Here's the cordwood stash for one of the mills. Without wood, they couldn't live. The other problem that I haven't solved is where they got their water, because there wasn't any in Silver City. Okay, this is a scripture stereo card. I'm sorry it's such poor quality, but I had to copy it off of eBay. The guy who bought it wouldn't send me a copy, so I had to. He paid $400 for it. But you can see you've got about 20 horses here pulling a wagon load of ore. This is the Hope Mill. The Hope Mine was over here. They had this tramway going across the road to get to the mill. This appeared about the same time the railroad did. Here's the slide we had earlier, but in a little bit more detail. You can see more of the Bacon over here and the trench. You can see the wagon going up. Just think, to keep these two mills running and the Kelsey mill running, you need about 100 tons of ore a day, all coming down the hill in wagons. Their newspapers describe it as just a perpetual parade, train of wagons, no space in between. And going in the other direction were the wood wagons. So you can see why a railroad was needed. Okay, what happened here is that Mr. Fair was the superintendent of the Hale and Norcross mine, and they made a big strike. Mr. Fair didn't tell the principal stockholders, Mr. Mills, Mr. Sharon, etc. He did tell his friends, and they quietly bought up the stock and got enough of the stock that at the next stockholders meeting they had control of the mine. They had control of the Rhode Island Mill, which is kind of across the street from where the Belcher was, but they didn't have enough milling capacity to handle everything they were going to get out of the Rhode Island mine. I'm sorry, the Hale and Norcross. So they bought the Silver City mills because they were basically not being used. The Trench Mill was built in '61, the Bacon Mill in '63. They were all steam powered. Eventually, the Gold Hill and Virginia City Water Company built a flume from the Occidental Tunnel, which came down to the Occidental Mill, and then that water came to Silver City. They also purchased the Kelsey and the Sullivan. The Kelsey was kind of the standby when they needed more capacity or when they had a problem with the Bacon and Trench. They ran the Kelsey, and the Sullivan they tore down to get the land. This is a newspaper article which basically describes life in Silver City. I'll read it for you quickly because I'm sure those of you in the back can't see it. Our sister town of Silver City is in a decidedly flourishing condition at the present time. The chief element of her prosperity is her numerous mills, all of which are actively working. The Bacon Mill and the Trench Mill, for instance, owned by the Hale and Norcross mine proprietors, disperse monthly no less than $12,000 to employees and for supplies, castings, and new machinery. Nearly or quite all of that amount is dispersed right there in Silver City. And passing through the town during the day one would hardly suppose that there were so many people living in about the town as there really are. In the evening, however, the saloons, boarding houses, and trading places tell the story. At the end of this, I'll read you the obituary. This is the slide which our esteemed Vice President has already read for you. Basically, that before the railroad was completed, it did sign contracts with Fair for moving Hill and Norcross ore to the trench mill and the bacon mill. The rate was $1.10 per ton, and the requirement here was the delivery to be within 20 feet of the crushers via a trestle at least 20 feet above the battery floor for the bacon mill. As usual, the railroad wanted public money to help it build, and they went to the counties, as we've talked about before. Lyon County agreed to give $75,000 of bonds, provided the main line of the railroad passed within 200 feet of the bacon mill. When Mr. James did his survey, he discovered that in order to keep a constant grade to Gold Hill, the railroad would be about 500 feet above Silver City, and there was no way to put it on the main line. V&T management decided that they would reach the bacon mill site by building a branch line, but they didn't tell the Lyon County supervisors they were going to do that. So they just went ahead and did it. And on March 14th, a special train, the Lyon locomotive, a coach, they only had one, combine number 1, because number 2 was still getting built in the Virginia City car shop. But anyway, they took these supervisors to Silver City down the branch, plied them with food, booze, and cigars, and lo and behold, the commissioners decided that it was okay. Well, there was then another election, the complexion of the Board of Supervisors changed, and the new board said, no, this isn't what's in the contract, and they did not issue the bonds, and there were very bad feelings. This eventually was the county was sued by the railroad, and eventually went to the Supreme Court of the state, and after my talk, Brian's going to tell you all about the Supreme Court issue. Okay, so here's the V&T coming downhill. Here's where the branch line took off, and then we went off down. It looks like a nice bunch of curves down into Silver City. From that 1874 map, you can see that the trench mill and the bacon mill occupied this entire corner. Eventually, both mills would expand to fill up this entire area, and the railroad, of course, was coming down over here. The Kelsey was off in here. Blow this up, you see the railroad. This map finally does show that there was a spur down here. You had to have a spur down here because when the locomotive came down with loaded cars, there were empty cars on the spur that was on top of the ore trestle. So he had to move the empties out, put them someplace, so they put them here, and then they could let the loads drop down into here. The ore slide, the cordwood slide down to the storage area, and then the ore slide down to the ore bins for the other mills. And so we have our famous picture that Mr. Watkins took. You can see how much the trench mill has increased in size. One thing I want to point out here, for those of you who don't know, there was one large steel car that moved ore from the bins up here down to a transfer place here. There were then two railways that came down. One that went to the trench, and there you can see it, this little car, transfer car sitting up there, and the other one that went down to the bacon. You can see there was a transition here in the grade to get down to the bacon. You can also see a pile of cordwood here that's almost taller than the mill. Without that cordwood, they were dead in the water. Here's a view from the backside. It kind of gives you a nice idea how tall that thing really was. Here's the bacon and the trench, the transfer station, and the tramway coming down. Here is the cordwood slide for the upper storage area, and the mill, and the mine, and the excuse me, the ore bins for the Kelsey and the other mill, the mines that were going to be furnished by wagon loads. There's the same view, but from the other side of the street. Again, another scripture, stereo card, which was in much better condition. Here's the Kelsey again. The trench in what I would say it's halfway increased size. The bacon with this, it's almost where it got to be totally. But look over here, you'll see that the tramway is now different. The ore that goes to the trench doesn't go up on a little rise here. There's now this huge slide bin. So this whole system was modified over time as it wore out and as they figured out more needs for moving ore. I blew it up there so you could get a little bit better picture. See, we still have the transition here between where the trench ore stopped and the bacon ore went on. You can imagine, though, how noisy that was, how smelly it was, because they were still hauling some wood by wagons, and of course the horses would like to defecate wherever they were. Okay, here's what it looked like in '76 now. You can see the bacon has been expanded. Here's the tramway. But you can also see there's still a lot of horses. Cordwood stacked up, another wagon delivering stuff. The wagons never went away. What's missing from this view of the milling town? Tailings. Where's the waste? There was no room for the waste in Silver City. Little bit clearer picture of the same thing. This is different though, because here you have a wagon with horses. This picture was taken at a different time. Pullet bringing in cordwood. The railroad had been in operation for 6 years, but the wagons were still bringing up wood in competition with the railroad. Okay, the tailing solution was this. The proprietors of the bacon and trench mills have commenced building a long line of flume, or sluice, a foot square, to conduct the tailings and waste of those mills about 2 miles to Ophir Flat, a mile below Johnstown. They are working hard at it night and day and have it already completed as far as the Eastern Slope Mill. Gold Hill Daily News, February 2nd, 1870. The railroad's not even there yet, but they're already gearing up to get rid of large volumes of tailings. This is the USGS map. Here's the trench mill, and if you look closely, you can find the tailing sluice coming down. And how do I know that that line is really the tailing sluice? Well, if you go down the map, it tells us. Tailing flume. Comes down here to Ophir Flat. You see there is something called a tailing sluice. There's a big pond, and then the Ophir Mill. And if you blow it up, you can see the little bit better detail. And there it is, courtesy of Mr. Watkins. You can see the flume coming down. The flume then discharges to a blanket flume, which then discharges into the pond, and then the mill over here works on the tailings. I think that before they built this blanket sluice, this thing probably discharged into something here, because I can't figure out why else that raises there. The mill operated on tailings till 1884, 5 years later than the mills in Silver City operated. So it took them 5 years to process this lake. There's the blanket sluice. Those, I believe that each of those slots is 18 inches wide, and that was like 200 feet long. Blanket sluice flume is just nothing more than a lot of fuzzy cloth with the tailings flowing very slowly over it. Theory being that gravity will drop the heavier pieces of material down. They'll get caught in the fuzz of the blanket flume, and what eventually flows out into the pond has had most of the heavy solids removed. Apparently they worked because almost every mill built one. Okay. Progress sometimes isn't good. This says that the lower end of Gold Canyon between Silver City and Dayton was formerly one of the busiest locations in the county for milling, tailings, and sulfurous savings, employing a large number of men. During the last year or two, however, this business has totally or nearly all failed. Only 2 mills, the Excelsior and the Atlanta, are running, and all the rest are quiet and going to ruin. And where formerly every inch of the canyon from the Nevada Foundry down into Dayton was occupied by a continual string of blanket sluices and apparatus for the savings of sulfurous materials, nothing of the kind now remains. The bed of the canyon is dry, and that part of the canyon is almost entirely deserted. The reason for this is the long flume, which has been constructed from the Bacon Mill down to Loafer Flat, conveying all the water and tailings of the canyon to that. The consequence is that Silver City and Dayton are both made to seriously feel this taking away of steady and profitable employment. For so many men between the two places, to say nothing of the supplies, in the way of provisions, lumber, and other things that were formerly required by them. So progress is good for some and bad for others. Okay, let's talk about the railroad. As I said before, it only lasted 10 years, but was a very, very busy place for those 10 years. The survey for the Silver City branch was begun and completed in August of 1869. That was before the railroad even got to the Comstock itself, and a number of months, of course, before the agreement with Fair was made. But they knew they had to get to Silver City some way, and it was in August of '69 when James finally realized that the main line couldn't get there. You can see in February, mid-February of 1870, they began the track laying, and on March 5th, the branch was finally in service. So they wasted no time getting it done because they were guaranteed revenue for the Bacon and Trench Mill. At this point in time, they had just barely gotten to Virginia City. We do have Mr. James' field notes from the survey. And you can see he started that Silver City branch survey long before he knew how he was going to get into Virginia City, and long before he had done surveys for any of the other major mills. Gives you an idea of the importance of this branch to the railroad. Courtesy of Google Earth, we started up here and coming down, and it looks sort of like an easy trip. You'll find out later that it was not. This is a better picture with more contrast. The railroad took off down here, and you can see that it was not really straight. There were lots of little jigs and jogs in it, some of which are more due to its use as a fire railroad after the red was taken out. But then it went around the hill here and finally got to Carson, to Silver City. All of the ore delivery and firewood delivery was down here. There was a lumber yard here, and the lumber, we're talking now finished lumber, and rough lumber, construction lumber, and that had to get downtown by wagon road. We even have his cost estimate for the branch, and you can see his estimate was almost $40,000 in this time $1869. Probably $1 million now, if you could ever build it, of course. As usual with the surveyors, the excavation yards, number of ties, amount of rail, number of spikes, excuse me, fish bars, etc. Excuse me. And there's this handwritten estimate, which I fixed up so you could read it before. So I didn't make up those numbers, there they are in reality. He said, oh, I just want to give you details. Okay, trackage. The main line was 1.46 miles. Turntable lead was 400 feet. There was a turntable at Silver City. That number has been reported as 300, 400, and 500 feet at different locations. Thank you. The grade about 121 feet to the mile. In March 1875, we know they put in a new sidetrack at Silver Switch, but they didn't tell us where it was. They replaced the turntable, and the property tax rolls claim that the main branch was 7,500 feet. Branch spur, almost 2,000 feet, that's 25% as long as the main line. Siding, 1,400 feet, that's 19%. To me, that is not one spur, it's a total of all the spurs. Likewise, the siding is not one siding, but a total of all the sidings that they have. So the issue is, where were the sidings, where were the spurs? We know one of the spurs was down by the ore tipple, and the branch turntable track was listed on this list as 500 feet. The turntable was in operation from the first day, because they were running trains from Virginia City down to Silver City and back again, so they had to be able to turn the locomotive. They put in a new table in 75. In March of 70, there was a telegraph station in operation. We don't know what it was in. In October of 1872, when they finally began scheduled passenger service from Reno to Virginia, they put stations in all of the different little towns, and Silver City now had a station and agency. That was reported in a different newspaper as a new building to be used as depot, telegraph office, and employee residence. And in March 75, they made an addition to the main building, and that lasted until 1878, when the station and office was closed. We have no photographs of any of those structures. Silver City was obviously not a place that people like to work. Mr. Queen seemed to like it there. He lasted about 4 years. He was replaced on the 15th by Mr. Blackmere, who lasted until the 26th of September. I believe Mr. Queen either died or was convicted of embezzlement, and they needed a short-term replacement, which was Mr. Blackmere. Mr. Bell came in, and he lasted about 9 months. He left on the 21st of 1875. Mr. Gaynor came in and lasted until almost a year later. June 6th, Mr. Farley came in, and he lasted 3 months. Then Mr. Martin came in, and he lasted 4 days. And then Mr. Harlan came in, and the record ended on December 31st. We don't know how long he lasted. But clearly, there were no saloons in the Silver Switch. Okay, the turntable, we believe, was about 50 feet, because they all were. It was a gasless turntable. It was also the only turntable between Carson and Virginia. The lead was absolutely level, and we don't know exactly how long it was. We'll talk about that later. But it did allow, it was so long that it allowed them to store cars and trains, that allowed trains to pass. When trains were late getting to Mount House, they would allow the up train to depart and meet the down train at Silver City, and one of them had to go in the hole on the turntable lead. There was also a water tank. This is what it looked like, because I walked it. Level turntable lead, turntable. This thing here was the subject of a long-ranging discussion between Stephen and I. The newspaper reported a engine house at Silver City. Well, that turned out to be the fire engine house, and I lost the discussion. But there was an extension, a depression into the hillside here, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, like next. This is what I found in 1982. This is the embankment leading to the turntable. The turntable had an embankment around it, and when they took it out, they extended the embankment and into this slot here, and from this point on to the main line was about 500 feet. So after they abandoned the turntable, etc., this was now a longer storage tract. Here you can see the cross-section. The hillside came up, the embankment around the pit, and then the side of the pit was dug into the hillside, and when I got there, this had sloped down into the pit. You can see, actually this is 85, sorry. You can see that this is that, what I called the engine house at one time, but this extension into the hillside beyond the turntable. And if you put all that on the current area, here's that long lead and the 50-foot turntable and the hole for the extension. This is all gone now. As you know, Yerington had to report to Mr. Mills on a regular basis about how he was spending money. By July of '73, the tramway and the ore bins were beginning to show their heavy use and the fact that they used untreated lumber and didn't paint them, and they were beginning to go bad. He apologized for having to spend $150 in short-term repairs and said next year he'd have to spend between $1,000 and $1,500 to keep things together. March 1st of 1870, they finished this area. June 12th of '74, they had a force of carpenters at work repairing the trestle works. April 20th, Mr. Yerington says to Mills, we absolutely have to overhaul and repair the ore dumps and car track. Timbers are completely rotten and the whole thing going down. July of '77, doing more work. February of '78, large gang of people plus engine number 6 are at work in section 15. So clearly, in the last 5 years of life, they were basically holding this together with baling wire. Things were not always smooth on this line. September 7th, 1872, the Daily News says the bright light noticed in the direction of the Carson River about midnight last night was not the Eureka Mill, but a couple of flat cars loaded with wood standing on the Silver City switch of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. Both were entirely consumed. This is the first notice we have that for reasons that are not understood by me, when the up train left loaded wood cars to go down the Silver City switch, they left them on the grade, not on the level turntable lead, and we'll discover later that that was not such a great idea. The other fire problem, the Gold Hill Daily News in 1875 says, as train number 11 was passing Silver City Switch, the sparks from the engine set fire to the station house. The platform around it and one end of the station house was consumed. The next day they said there was extinguished before any damage was done. This is pretty typical of the newspapers of the day. I need to go back and find out what the Territorial Enterprise said. But anyway, they had a fire. And that's not unusual, of course. This is the one that's really interesting. November 10th, 1872, a train of 5 flat cars and a Central Pacific boxcar got loose on the Silver City Switch and ran down the steep grade with frightful velocity. This train came into collision with 8 iron dump cars standing on the high trestle work at the trench mill. The collision demolished all the cars and a large portion of the trestle work and precipitated the debris down the cliff. No one was injured, but everybody in Silver City had to change their underwear. November 11th, the next day, a flat car loaded with nut pine got loose by the breaking of the brake block underneath and went for a locomotive and 3 cars which were backing up the sidetrack from the trestle work. This is interesting because it tells us that coming back up, the locomotive was downhill of the cars, which meant they had to have a runaround track down there, otherwise they could never have done that. The collision badly damaged the 3 flats and sent wood up higher than a kite, but no damage was done to the locomotive. The grade of the sidetrack is steep, 121 feet to the mile, and the disabled car went down like a streak of greased lightning. 3 men were on the car when the brake broke, and each jumped off and commenced throwing wood in front of it, but it was too late. Well, once again, why the hell were they parking these cars on the hill? December 10th, Pat Campbell, engineer of the locomotive Humboldt, was eating his supper at Silver City Station. The conductor, a smart aleck from the Union Pacific, ran the engine down the sidetrack and smashed the carload of wood. Jim Murray, Pat's fireman, seeing the engineer going, knowing that Pat was not aboard, tried to jump on for the purpose of stopping her, and then the attempt was knocked down and pretty badly bruised. There is considerable indignation about the matter among the trainmen of the road. Okay, passenger service. There wasn't any. Occasionally, an excursion train went down to Silver City if there were enough prepaid passengers. Usually, however, Silver City passengers for excursions had to make their way up to Silver Switch. Sometimes the railroad left cars there for them. Other times the trains would actually stop and people would board. There was regularly scheduled stage service between Silver City and Gold Hill. And the timetable, which is number 1, the first one, shows you that Silver was on the timetable, but there was no time for the train to stop. It just went by, unless it was dropping off cars. No passenger service at all. Here's the connecting stage. Rubbity and Bennett ran the stage line, and the train, this would connect with the 9 a.m. arrival in Gold Hill. And you left at 8:30 in the morning to make the train to get up to Gold Hill and take the train down. And so they ran every 2 hours, just like the railroad did. They were the shuttle to Silver City. This went on as far as there were people, as long as there were people working in Silver City. This was a very large excursion down to Bowers Mansion, the Silver City Miners Union. It took a few years for the Silver City miners to unionize, and that was another story, lots of bad blood. But on this date, 6 flat cars and 2 coaches drawn by the locomotive Empire left Virginia. 6 flat cars and 2 coaches with the locomotive Carson left Gold Hill. 2 caboose cars and 2 flat cars were switched off at Silver City Switch by the Humboldt to accommodate the crowd from that lively town. What we don't know here is whether the Humboldt took those cars down to Silver City or whether they were just stopped at Silver City and left there for the people who were going to ride up by coach. For freight operations, all of the records indicate that ore deliveries to the trench and bacon averaged 60 to 64 tons per day when the mills were running. The ore dump cars were 8 tons, of course, so you had 8 cars per day to each of the 2 mills, and they went in 2 separate trains. The trench train went down in the morning, and the bacon train went down in the afternoon. And the reason for that is that the Bacon and Trench, while owned by the same company, were operated as two independent financial operations, and the records were kept independently so that the supervisors of the two mills could be held accountable for their work. As I told you 2 years ago, the extra trains in the morning often went down to Silver City before the timetable trains and then ran back to Gold Hill with the empty ore cars, often as a second section of an up train, and the morning trains were usually to the Trench Mill. Extra trains often ran down to Silver City and back to Gold Hill late evening after the timetable trains, or came back as a second section of an up train. Again, records indicate the evening ore deliveries were to the Bacon. The wood loads got to Silver City on up trains and were left at Silver City Switch to be taken down by the ore trains that were delivering ore cars. Usually. Oftentimes, the conductors and engineers did what they damn well pleased. I asked Stephen to look at his employee timetables for this era. There are absolutely no operating instructions for the Silver City Bridge. Consequently, they did what they damn well pleased. Here are the records which allow me to tell you that these cars went down separately. This is the Bacon records for 1870, and you can see that you get 8 cars a day for almost every time. Occasionally, you see the 8 cars are split between 2 trains. I don't know why that was happening in this period of time, but it was very unusual, just a few times those cars. Whenever the mine was having problems or the mill was having problems, there were no trains. Strictly demand freight. I think I've told you this. We're going to go through that. Okay. As I said before, all of the work was done down here, and the issue we have is of how was all of this switched. We have no indication of how wood loads got down, unloaded, brought back, how ore cars got down, unloaded, brought back, except by somewhat using our imagination and what little information we have from the newspapers. But I think that it's pretty clear by the fact that in two newspaper articles, the locomotive is going back up the hill with the cars being pushed, that since the locomotives did not have hand brakes and relied on the tender brakes and compression braking from the cylinders, they needed the manual brakes on the cars to do the work, so there were lots of brakemen, obviously, twisting the brakes. And if they had the engine going downhill, with the pilot going downhill, the engineer can see where he's going and what he's doing. He can back up much more safely because he doesn't have the danger of a runaway. Clearly, the locomotive would have to switch the empty ore cars off the trestle and put them on that side spur before they could put the loads on. They'd have to drop those loads by gravity onto the trestle once the locomotive got out of the way. The real problem here is we don't have any factual information about how the engine got around the cars, and my hypothesis is that somewhere down there had to be a runaround spur, double connected siding. Okay, you've seen the ore delivery system. Let's talk a little bit more about that. This is another picture which I really like. But you can see here, here's the tramway coming down. There's 2 tram tracks on each of these trams. See, this one is very wide. The Bacon one is only half as wide. So you've got one little car dropping down by gravity and pulling the empty one back up. So there's a pair of tracks here and another pair of tracks over here. This car, there's only one of these big cars, and that had to be pulled back up by another car with a weight on it. Just exactly how they did that, we don't know, but there was no machine up here that could wind up a winch and pull that car back up by itself. One of the big problems was wood, as I said. All of the mills were steam powered. In the early years, when the V&T was almost always short of flat cars, sometimes the mills began to run short, and that occasioned very angry transmissions from the mill managers to Mr. Yarrington. And sometimes they would have to run a special train down. If they didn't have a locomotive to spare to take it down to Silver City Switch, guess what? It went down by gravity. I'm not going to go through this because we're going to run out of time, but it's just my imagination of how they did that. I'm not sure I'm happy about that. I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning when my body decided it didn't want my last beer anymore. And for the next hour and a half, I was doing imaginations of how you switch cars at Silver City. And there are many, many different ways to do it. If you notice, here is the wood slide, the cordwood slide. Looks very, very much like it does not, it's not really adjacent to the spur that's on the trestle. Talked about that 2 years ago. I believe that there was a siding in here for the cordwood cars to be unloaded and the cordwood to be thrown down. If that's true, you can hypothesize that there was a siding in here to service the firewood chutes and the Kelsey ore dump, and that there might have been a runaround down here. The problem with this hypothesis is that there's really not all that much room unless all of this was out on a trestle. This was done 20 years ago. We know from the map we just found that that spur was really out here and maybe even on a trestle. That's what the area looks like now. Down to this point, you have a very steep grade. From this point on, you have a very shallow grade, but a very definite downgrade, and I think that that was done again so they could do gravity switching down in this area. Somewhere down in here, there had to be a passing siding. It is possible that it was down in this area. It's possible that there was a spur in here for the lumber cars. However, every now and then we get a newspaper article that says that the runaways ran into a flat car down here on the main line. So again, we don't really know what was going on down there. Okay, 1878 was the last year of large volume ore production by the California mine and the Virginia. The Pacific Mill and Mining Company also controlled the Ophir mine, and actually it was the North End mines, and before they built the Union mine, they moved ore out of the North End via the Ophir hoist, and that mine produced ore for 13 months during 1879 and 1880. The Bacon Mill was closed and scrapped in July of 1878. One of the purported reasons was that after running for 18 years, so much spillage had occurred and gone through the boards and the floor that they surface mined underneath the mill. We do not know whether that really happened, but it's a nice story. The trench mill was closed in June of 1880, and Mr. Fair told Yarrington that if another strike occurred in Virginia City, they would not use the Silver City mills. Here are the ore records to both the trench and the Bacon from the Virginia. You can see in July of 78, the Bacon was shut down, no more traffic, but the Virginia continued on. In February 6th of 1878, Yarrington, in one of his letters to Mr. Mills, he says, "In view of our light business, I will on the 10th close Silver City office and the Washoe City office. Train conductors will do the business to and from these points. We are running our trains from this office without the aid of those telegraph stations. Wherever I can dispense with the man, I am doing it." So he's trying to save money. But the same month, Dear Mr. Mills, please find your check for $46,641 to cover this month's dividend. Mr. Sharon, please find your check of $27,984 to cover the dividend. So you see, the idea of paying CEOs lots of money and screwing the laborers isn't new. '79, you see, we switch out of Con Virginia ore to Ophir ore. I didn't make it up. Here are the ore shipments from 1879. This is actually a railroad piece of the railroad document. This is the railroad's audit and pay office. You can see that the Con Virginia was now going to the Morgan, and the trench mill was getting a little bit of Con Virginia ore, but mainly Ophir ore. I won't bore you with the mathematics, but those numbers imply 1 train per day, 5 days a week. And 1880, the end comes, Ophir ore till the end, but in June of 1880, service was stopped. June 23rd, they sold all of the